This story takes place when I was around 6 years old. This is a long story, so I apologize for that. I've never had to tell this story with enough detail to actually explain it all the way. But like I said before, it is true. In a quiet room, if you press your ear against a pillow, you can hear your heartbeat. As a kid, the muffled, rhythmic beats sounded like soft footsteps on a carpeted floor. And so as a kid almost every night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I would hear these footsteps and I would be ripped back to consciousness, terrified. For my entire childhood, I lived with my mother in a fairly nice neighborhood that was in a transitional phase. People of lower economic means were gradually moving in, and my mother and I were two of these people. We lived in the kind of house you would see being transported in two pieces on the interstate, but my mom took good care of it. There were a lot of woods surrounding the neighborhood that I would play in and explore during the day, but at night, as things often do to a kid, they took on a more sinister feeling. This, coupled with the fact due to the nature of our house, there was a fairly large crawl space underneath, filled my mind with imaginary monsters and inescapable scenarios, which would consume my thoughts when I was awoken by the footsteps. I told my mom about the footsteps, and she said that I was just imagining these things. I persisted enough that she blasted my ears with water from a turkey baster, once just to placate me. Of course, this didn't help. Despite all the creepiness and footsteps, the only weird thing that ever happened was that every now and then, I would wake up on the bottom bunk, despite having going to sleep on the top bunk. But this wasn't really out of the ordinary, since I'd sometimes get up to piss in the middle of the night, or get something to drink, and could remember just going back to sleep on the bottom bunk. This would happen once or twice a week, but waking up on the bottom bunk wasn't too terrifying. One of these nights, I didn't wake up on the bottom bunk. I had heard the footsteps, but was too far gone to be woken up by them. And when I was awoken, it wasn't from the sound of footsteps or from a nightmare, but because I was really cold, freezing. When I opened my eyes, I saw stars. I was out in the middle of the woods. I sat up immediately and tried to figure out what was going on. I thought I was dreaming, but that didn't seem right, though neither did me being in the middle of the woods. There was a deflated pool float right in front of me, one of those ones shaped like a shark. This only added to the surreal feeling, but after a while it seemed like I just wasn't going to wake up, because I wasn't asleep. I stood up to orient myself, but I didn't recognize these woods. I played in the woods by my house all the time, and so I knew them really well. But if these weren't the same woods, then how could I get out? I took a step and felt a shooting pain in my foot, which knocked me back to where I had just been laying. I had stepped on a thorn. By the light of the moon, I could see that they were everywhere. I looked at my other foot, but it was fine, and as a matter of fact, so was the rest of me. I didn't have another scratch on me, and I wasn't even that dirty. I started to cry for a little bit and then stood back up. I didn't know which way to go, so I just picked a direction. I resisted the urge to call out since I wasn't sure I wanted to be found by who or what might be out there. I had been walking for what seemed like hours. I tried to walk in a straight line, and tried to course correct when I had to take detours, but I was a kid and I was afraid. There weren't any howls or screams, and only once did I hear any noise that scared me. It sounded like a crying baby. Now that I'm older, I think it was just a cat, but at the time I had panicked. I ran, veering in different directions to avoid big thicks of bushes and collapsed trees. And I was paying close attention to where I was walking, because by that point my feet were in pretty bad shape. I paid too much attention to where I was stepping, but not enough to where these steps were leading, because not long after that, hearing the crying, I saw something that filled me with a kind of despair I haven't experienced since. It was the pool float. I was only 10 feet from where I had woken up. This wasn't magic, or some supernatural space blending. I was just straight up lost. Up until that moment, I thought more about getting out of the woods than how I got in, but being back at the beginning caused my mind to swim. I wasn't even sure that these were my woods. I had only been hoping that they were. Had I just run in a huge circle around that spot, or did I just get turned around and start making my way back? How was I going to get out? At the time, I thought the North Star was just the brightest star, and so I looked and found the brightest one and followed it. Eventually, things started to look more familiar, and when I saw the ditch, I knew I'd finally made it out. By that point, I was walking really slowly because my feet hurt so much, but I was so happy to be so close to home that I broke into a light jog. When I actually saw the roof of my house over a neighboring, lower set house, I let out a light sob and ran faster. I just wanted to be home. I had already decided that I wouldn't say anything because I had no idea what I could possibly say. I would get back into the house somehow, clean up, and get back in my bed. My heart sunk as I rounded the corner, and my house came fully into view. Every light in the house was on. I knew my mom was up, and I knew I would have to explain, or at least try to, where I had been, and I couldn't even figure out where to start. My run became a jog, which became a walk. I saw her silhouette through the blinds, and although I was worried about how to explain things to her, that didn't matter to me at the time. I walked up the couple of steps to the porch and put my hand on the doorknob and turned. Right before I pushed it open, 2 arms wrapped around me and pulled me back. I screamed as loud as I could. "Mom! Help me! Please! Mom!" The feeling of being so close to being safe, and then being physically pulled away from it, filled me with a kind of dread that is, even after all these years, indescribable. The door I had been torn away from opened, and a flash of hope shot through my heart, but it wasn't my mom. It was a man, and he was enormous. I thrashed around and kicked at the shins of the person holding me, while also trying to get away from the person who had just come out of my house. I was scared, but I was furious. "Let me go! Where is she? Where's my mom? What did you do to her?" As my throat stung from screaming, and I was drawing in another breath, I became aware of a sound that had been present for longer than I had perceived it. "Honey, please calm down. I've got you." It sounded like my mom. The arms loosened and set me down, and as the man approached me blocked out of the porch light, with his head I noticed his clothes. He was a cop. I turned to face the voice behind me and saw that it really was my mom this time. Everything was okay. I began to cry, and the 3 of us went inside. "I'm so glad you're home, sweetie. I was worried I'd never see you again." By that point, she was crying too. "I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. I just wanted to come home. I'm so sorry." "It's okay, son. Just don't ever do that again. I'm not sure me or my shins could take that." A little laughter broke through my sobs, and I smiled a bit. "Well, I'm sorry for kicking you, but why'd you have to grab me like that?" "I was just afraid you'd run away again." I was confused. "What do you mean?" "We found your note on your pillow," she said, and pointed at the piece of paper that the police officer was sliding across the table. I picked up the note and read it. It was a running away letter. It said that I was unhappy and never wanted to see her or any of my friends again. The police officer exchanged a few words with my mom. While I stared at the letter, I didn't remember writing a letter. I didn't remember anything of this. But even if I sometimes went to the bathroom at night and didn't remember, or even if I could have gone into the woods on my own, even if all that could have been true, the only thing I knew at this point was, this isn't how you spell my name. I didn't write this letter. While stationed in Iraq during Operation Desert Storm, my brother, Gerald, was lost for 2 weeks. Officially, it was claimed he was captured by the Republican Guard and tortured before managing to escape. The condition of his body when he was found helped lend credence to the explanation. Lacerations, broken bones, and all sorts of other physical damage covered him from head to toe. He never recovered from this experience. He was honorably discharged from the Marine Corps after 6 months in a military hospital. When he was sent home, he began to display signs of Gulf War syndrome. Years passed, and his wife, Leah, cared for him as he weakened. His cognition, memory, and communication skills evaporated. Before he died last year, the brother I had loved had been reduced to glimmering rust. In his final moments, as Leah and I looked on, we were ready for his suffering to end. Then something happened, causing me to jump and Leah to gasp. For the first time in 8 years, Gerald expressed clear, articulate words. "I fell in a hole." He went on, his voice clear and strong, as Leah and I listened, spellbound. Gerald had been patrolling the outskirts of a village when the ground beneath him gave away. He fell for a very long time. He landed at an angle, his right leg plunging into soft moss and dirt while his left struck a rock, shattering the femur. He couldn't believe he wasn't dead. The pain, he told us, while indescribable, took a back seat to what he had seen. He fell into what he assumed was a cavern. As deep as he was, he expected to be in pitch darkness, but the cavern was anything but. Bioluminescent vines and fungi covered the walls and studded ceiling far above. He heard water flowing somewhere nearby. Gerald did his best to extricate himself from the moss while trying to avoid losing consciousness from the pain of his broken leg. Some of the glowing vines which adorned the walls were very long and within his reach. He pulled himself up and out, then crawled on his belly down the small hill where he landed, on the main floor of the cavern. The floor was covered in feathers, silvery white and iridescent. They left streaks of dust on everything they touched, like the wings of a moth. It wasn't unpleasant, not at all in fact. It was warm and spicy, entirely uncharacteristic of what one would think when hundreds or even thousands of feet underground. The dust, despite its enjoyable odor, grew thick and choking as he crawled in the direction of the rushing water. He came across an ancient-looking branch, which he used to haul himself onto his healthy leg. Using the wood as a crutch, he continued to move. The bioluminescence intensified as the cavern narrowed. The pinkish light was coming from all directions. Gerald realized its source was some kind of mold that blanketed nearly everything in the cavern. The closer he got to the water, the more mold there was. After walking for a few minutes, small patches of mold began falling from the ceiling like glowing snowflakes. The surreality of the cavern, the mold, and the feathers instilled a feeling of awe in Gerald, which clashed uncomfortably with the overwhelming pain in his leg and the fear that he'd never find his way out. Not long after, he reached a river. It was slow and shallow but quite wide, stretching easily a quarter-mile across. Mold flakes floated in thick clumps on its surface. No feathers, though. Whatever the river's source was, the feathers were from somewhere else. He followed the river for a while. Despite the coolness of the water nearby, the cavern grew warmer, narrower too. The wide, tranquil river narrowed into frothing pink rapids. Gerald had worried the bank would give way and he'd plunge into the rushing water. It did. For countless minutes, Gerald was carried by the current and tossed onto rocks, further damaging his leg and carving lacerations all over his body. As he struggled, he glimpsed tunnels on either side of him, some too narrow for a man to crawl through, some wide enough to fit a parade of elephants. Many of the wider ones were choked with feathers, which joined him in the glowing mold clots in the turbid water. A roar filled the air, echoing off the stone walls and ceiling and drowning out the sound of the river. Before he knew what was happening, Gerald was airborne. As he tumbled through the air, he saw the waterfall he'd fallen from. He slammed into the water below and lost consciousness. Gerald regained his senses sometime later on the bank of a wide lake. He was on his back, with his broken leg twisted underneath him. Screaming in agony, he didn't notice the movement nearby. Not until it was on top of him. Something wrapped around his ankle and hauled him into the air. The lake below him shrank as he was pulled even higher, over a ledge, and stuffed upside down into a crevice in the ceiling. At this point, as he told the story, Gerald began to cry. Leah held his head against her chest and did her best to console him, but his sobs were unrelenting. Gasping for breath and leaking tears, he continued to choke out his words. The view below him was no longer one of water and feathers and bioluminescent mold. The view was now one of horror and depression. Piles of mutilated bodies lay in wreathing heaps on the floor. Some were dead, but most appeared alive. Their open mouths produced no screams, but agony was obvious in their expressions. Their wounds gaped and wept. The majority of the damage was to their backs, but many chests and bellies had been flayed and left to leak their contents on the flailing victims trapped underneath them. Gerald did his best to take it all in and think rationally. Craning his head and neck to look over his shoulder, he saw something massive in the distance. Something alive and moving in strange, circular patterns around a stationary central point. There was less light in this part of the cavern than when he had initially fallen. There was no bioluminescent mold covering the walls and the ceiling, and even if there was, it would have only been coated with blood and gore. No. The only light around him was from fire. Torches stood inside holes bored into the stone floors and walls and ceilings. Flames gouted and flowed within their osseous confines, illuminating the killing floor of violence and torment, which stretched all the way to the Leviathan far behind him. The rock in which Gerald's leg was stuffed cracked. Gerald began to fall, head first, toward the pile of bodies 100 feet below. He knew this was one fall he wouldn't be able to survive. As he imagined his spine splintering as his head struck the head or face of someone else below, his ankle was grabbed again. The force of the grab, combined with the velocity of his fall, snapped his pelvis. The pain was immediate and unendurable. Gerald saw dark stars blooming in his vision. His consciousness wandered. He traveled in a gray fog towards the colossus he'd glimpsed while trapped. Part of him was aware of the thing which held his ankle. It was thin and had tentacles, a living vine, or organic cord, or serpentine whip, something he couldn't understand. He was dropped to the floor in front of the huge creature. Whatever it was, it didn't have his attention. The fog of his semi-consciousness was burnt away by the sight of incredibly bright, white light. It was light unlike anything he'd ever seen. The radiance should have been blinding, but it caused no pain at all. It didn't travel either. It was confined to one particular area. It produced no blazing heat or discomfort whatsoever, only calming warmth. He felt overwhelming serenity as he locked his eyes on the man-sized light source. The serene calm was punctured as tens of thousands of organic tendrils erupted from the somewhere above and raped their way into brilliance. Gerald experienced a sense of hideous, disembodied violation, as if he were watching the assault of a loved one while filling every moment of their pain with his own body. He cringed and retched, tears filling his eyes, as he watched the tendrils pull a man from somewhere inside the light source. The spicy, warm smell from earlier in the day filled Gerald's nostrils. The man from the light struggled against the grasp of the tendrils, his nude, muscular body completely helpless against their strength. As the man was pulled into the room with Gerald and the tendrils, Gerald gasped. The man's back was home to a pair of enormous wings. They flapped and sent violent currents of wind across the floor, blowing dust in all directions. While the man struggles, more tendrils came down from the ceiling. They uprooted the appendages from the man's back. The sound of heavy shrubbery being torn from the ground filled the air. The man's face contorted into a shriek of abject, torturous agony, but he made no sound. The only noise was from the nauseating tearing as the man was disfigured. Feathers broke from the wings and floated to the ground. With one final tug, the wings were separated from his body. Their stumps leaked dark blood which puddled on the dirt floor, contrasting obscenely against the magnificence of the white light just feet away. The man stopped struggling. He slumped, his muscles relaxed, and stared at the ground in front of him. A series of much thinner tendrils descended and plucked all the feathers from the wings and shuttled them away, leaving the bleeding amputations in the dirt. Another tendril whipped down at a blinding speed, striking the man's abdomen and splitting the flesh. His intestines bulged from the wound, and the tendrils holding him pulled him through the air towards the countless other bodies, Leah and I watched Gerald with horrified amazement as he recalled these events. We had no idea if he was telling the truth, or if it was all just a manifestation of the illness which was about to take him from us. The three of us wept while Gerald looked around, as if trying to determine whether or not we believed him. I felt like I needed to say something, so I asked, "What happened next? How did you get out?" Leah nodded, encouraging him to go on. Gerald's voice dropped to a whisper. Disoriented and in immense pain, Gerald tried to look around. The room was too big. He couldn't get a good idea of what he was seeing or where he was, but he knew he was right in front of the creature he'd seen. He tried to struggle to his feet, but the injury to his hip and leg was too great. The fractured bones ground against one another, and he screamed so hard he felt his lungs might burst. He was grabbed again, this time by his shoulders. Two tendrils hauled him up and up and up. He saw the thing in front of him, the Colossus, the Leviathan, the Serpent. The head of an impossibly large snake bulged at the apex of a body of thick trunks. Each trunk had bifurcated into a series of thinner trunks. Each thinner trunk had bifurcated into a series of tendrils. Each series of tendrils had into more thinner tendrils, and so on. The thick, spicy odor filled the area again. He knew it meant more wings were being destroyed. The snake stared at him, its yellow eye full of hideous intelligence and unknowledgeable age. They gazed at one another, and Gerald heard words in his head. Words that were not spoken to him, but thought at him. "Tell everyone what you saw. Tell everyone what I am. Let them know I'll be coming soon." The next thing Gerald knew, he was on his back, staring at the unforgiving sun of the Iraqi desert. He was found by the locals hours later. Gerald's whispering tapered off, and he closed his eyes. I was terrified he'd passed away. Leah shook him and said his name a few times, panic raising in her voice. Gerald opened his eyes. His lips parted. "The serpent," Gerald whispered. He coughed and stared at the ceiling, a tear trickling from the corner of his eyes. It was wrapped around a tree. The tree was filled with apples, millions upon millions of them. I watched as tiny snakes crawled into the ripest ones, pieces of him. Then the apples disappeared. They went into a hole in the air, and I could see what was on the other side of the holes. Orchards, trees all over the world. His apples are filling them. His eyes fluttered closed, and he breathed the last words we'd ever hear him speak. We've been eating them for millenniums. He's inside us all.